Good afternoon and early evening to you all. My name is Linwood Sloan. I am the executive director of the Commonwealth Monument Project, and the Live and Learn series is an alternating series with Lyceum, meaning panels, keynote speaks, and presentations of papers, and Chautauqua, meaning the teaching table. Each one teach one. Each one bring one back into the sun. This series is sponsored by the Commonwealth Monument Project and the Dauphin County Library System. And I have this next slide, please. On your left, you see the full-life bronze figure of Thomas Morris Chester. And on your right, you see an example of our historians, scholars, humanists, educators, and enthusiasts who hunt the history of Americans' African-American community. We lovingly refer to them as our history detectives. May I have the next slide, please? And we are very excited to announce that in 2020, and as a result of the completion of the monument, the International Institute for Peace Through Tourism, our parent organization, has joined forces through a memorandum of understanding with the T. Morris Chester Welcome and Research Center, the soon expansion and innovation of our McCormick Public Library on the riverfront. And we'll end today with you hearing a great deal about both that partnership and about this exciting new space. And may I have the next slide, please? It will be the home of our Live and Learn Lyceum Chautauqua Series, and also the home of the Pennsylvania Past Players, the first person living history presenters who present in all 9 counties of central Pennsylvania. Now, that's exciting news because they have been a company without a home, and we will be able to be in residence at the Haldeman Haley House starting this spring. Next slide, please. We like to start our series with spotlights on new history and innovative programs, and we're going to present you with 3 updates and breaking news, as all media says, about these exciting programs. We're spotlighting Penn State University and the Colored Convention Project, and we have with us Dr. Gabrielle Pierre-Foreman. The relationship with Messiah University and the Pennsylvania State Library about a digitization of their research and finding of the 100 families and names on the monument. And we have Dr. David Pettigrew and Mr. Michael Lear with us. And an exciting announcement about the Lancaster history and their PHMC Award, Pennsylvania Historic and Museum Commission's Award, to digitize their African-American collection. And we will have the Vice President of the Lancaster History, Robin Surratt, with us. And so I'll turn it now to Dr. Gabrielle Pierre-Foreman. May I have the next slide, please? And their exciting work about the Color Convention movement, which begins with the launch, it doesn't begin, but the newest information, our breaking information, is the launch of their book. Welcome, Dr. Foreman.
It's such a pleasure to be here today with this group of enthusiasts and humanists and citizen scholars who are doing the work of resurrecting a history that has been scattered, lost, buried, misremembered, dismembered, disremembered. The work itself that we're resurrecting was done by amazing individuals, but also individuals in collectives, so that we are coming together as a collective to resurrect this history is a fitting tribute to the work that they themselves laid a foundation for and laid so much for us to build on. So I want to thank you, Lenwood. I want to thank this group. I'm now at Penn State, where I am the launching co-founder of the Center for Black Digital Research, where we not only house the colored conventions, but also the New Black Women's Organizing Archive and Douglas Day, which is what we call a day of collective love for Black history, where we have digitized Black records and then transcribe them. We've done this with the Black Convention movement, and this book is the first book, and I'll actually do a slide in a minute, but this book is the first full-length book in more than 50 years, and the second full-length book, period, that documents this amazing history, which is a prequel to the NAACP, quite literally, and also to the National Association of Colored Women in so many ways. The people who were involved, Pennsylvanians like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who are the elders of the NACW movement, also emerge from both being blocked out of the colored conventions movement. There were so few women who were involved as delegates, although she appears on the podiums for many years, through the daughters of so many of the activists who then flourish into the National Association of Colored Women. Du Bois himself is the grandson of a delegate to the 1847 convention. Langston Hughes is the grandchild of Charles Langston, who was working with William Howard Day, one of Pennsylvania's transplanted heroes and activists, and part of the Monument Project as well. So I just wanted to say a little bit about the convention movement. I want to actually get a look at everybody for a second. Let me go to the full screen. Is there any way to get out of that slideshow?
Yes, could you take us out of the slide?
Beautiful. How many people actually know about the convention movement?
Ashley, is it at all possible for you to bring up the full screen of all observers and presenters? Is that? I am not quite sure of technology ever, but
it is amazing to me that this movement started in 1830, where 5 of the first national convention movements were held in Pennsylvania, but delegates from 7 of the 28 free states at that point actually gathered in Pennsylvania to begin this convention movement. They were deeply invested not only in freedom from enslavement, but also in the very rights that we're invested in now, in educational access and justice, in labor rights. Some of the quotes about labor and capital cannot coexist unless they do so in equality that come out right after the Civil War. Those convention delegate speeches and orations speak to the importance of labor and Black access to good paying jobs and to equal access to leadership in manufacturing, et cetera. So education, labor equality, freedom from state-sanctioned violence becomes really important in the many committees they have on what they called murders and outrages, which again resonates in this time in ways that we can't even, that are disturbingly prescient and prophetic. And at the same time, they are deeply interested in political rights and in voting rights. So this is a movement that outlasts the abolitionist movement and the anti-slavery movement by more than 30 years. And that almost every single one of the lions of 19th century history are involved in this movement. The Color Conventions Project has created a digital archive and also a group of exhibits that create maps of neighborhoods where the conventions were held, that get the newspaper articles like the ones that we're going to discuss today and map them in relationship to the events that they're responding to on one map so that you can see the coverage of these conventions. For the 1893 convention, which was called the Henry McNeill Turner Convention, for example, where they're really talking about this question of emigration and whether or not there is a place in the United States for Blacks, or whether or not we should go to Liberia or should go to Haiti or should go to the Caribbean, depending on the moment of these discussions, which again span from 1830, where they are begun in the last year of Bishop Richard Allen's life, all the way through to the 1890s, when they morph into tributaries of other civil rights movements rather than end themselves. So I'm going to ask if you could just let me share the screen. I'll just talk for 2 more minutes and then I'll jump off, if you would be so kind. All right. So this is the book. I love this photograph because one of the things it shows us is that women and children are involved. If you are not looking at the podium where the delegates are, but rather you're looking at the pews, the literally hundreds of thousands of people who went to these meetings over the 7 decades of their existence. You see the women and children who probably were also housing the delegates as they came through. We have found the advertisements that actually are for boarding houses where delegates stayed. We were honored and humbled that Miss Magazine put this on the list of most anticipated books in 2021, and that the Library Journal said that it was a must read for researchers and students.
Doctor, we're not seeing the shared screen.
That is not on my end. Somebody needs to allow me to share the screen. Can somebody do that?
Ashley?
I have it set so all panelists can share. So.
Okay, hold on. Give me a second.
And we're with you.
All right. So I love this photo again, because if we move from the podiums to the pews, you not only see how many people are in this meetings, and literally we have documents that say that people come out to see the speeches in the evenings, that in crowds that are equal to 2,000 to 3,000 to 4,000 people are coming out to actually see speakers like Frederick Douglass, Henry Highland Garnett, William Howard Day, etc. So here is the original image before it was put onto the book itself. This is the '69 convention in Washington, D.C. Again, they move beyond the Civil War. They start before the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society, the American Anti-Slavery Society, the New England Slavery Society, the 3 societies, right, that we think of as launching the anti-slavery movement or the antebellum anti-slavery movement. The Colored Conventions movement, again, starts in Bishop Richard Allen's last year at Mother Bethel in Philadelphia, 3 years before that. This is what we usually think of when we think of anti-slavery, right? Here we see again, right, some of the Pennsylvania abolitionists. There's Robert Purvis. Here is another image of Douglass and the Admonius sisters, the Edmondson sisters. But this is actually what we're interested in. What does it mean to have Black people involved in a parallel politics of organizing that allowed them to be ready for the 35 Black folks who are elected into the Virginia legislature right after the Civil War, for example, the representation and the working across class of recently enslaved people and those who had freed themselves earlier and gone through this kind of political education. The 16 articles in the book, which right now is selling for under $20 at the UNC Press, but we also ask that you purchase it from Harriet's Bookstore in Philadelphia, Essewan in California, Black bookstores. The book is also is connected to digital exhibits that are on our site at coloredconventions.org, where you can also find more than 200 proceedings and other newspaper records that document this rich history. Beforehand, they were in books like this one that could sell up to $3,000 for 12 of the national conventions, rare and dog-eared. Some of you probably have these in your library or collections. Now we have I don't even know how to say quintupled. What's after quadrupled, guys? What's
quintupled?
Quintupled. We have quintupled the number of records that are freely available. And we've also got some licensing agreements so that we can provide visual documentation that are often behind paywall and just no good to those of us who are part of the cultural descendants of the very people who launched the movement that we continue right now. So I just want to thank you again for inviting me to say that the work that we're doing seems to be a sibling to so much of the work that is being done in Harrisburg and other places, to thank Len Wood so much for the cultural work that he is doing and the communities that he is gathering, and to say that none of this work matters at all if we're not in community and if we're not continuing the spirit of resistance and the spirit of organizing for rights and for dignity for all people that our ancestors left for us to do.
Dr. The Monument Project is purchasing multiple copies of the book. We will present a copy to the Dauphin County Historical Society, the Dauphin County Library will get multiple copies for theirs, the State Library and the State Archives. So we'll both promote individuals to collect the book and we'll provide them in the public.
Thank you. The last thing I want to say is just a shout out to the artists who are in the room, that public history has always come through our culture, and the culture makers in the room are people who have preserved that for us, the bards, the playwrights among us. We also just always appreciate being a space enriched by your presence.
Thank you so much, Dr. Foreman. We look forward to inviting you back. I'm going to do a teaser where you can talk about your mural projects. So please look for my invitation in the weeks and months to come. All blessings to you. Thank you very much. I get to shout out to Dr. David Pettigrew and Michael Lear about their work here with regard to both the history that we've collected for the 100 voices and the incredible digitization information that they have collected on the once valued, now vanished historical days war. Gentlemen, good evening. Dr. Pettigrew, Michael,
Good evening.
Voice to you.
Yeah. Hi, I'm David Pettigrew. I'm professor of history and archaeology at Messiah University and one of the directors of the Digital Harrisburg project. And it's awesome to be with you all in community this afternoon. And I'm here with Michael Lear, who's a rare collections librarian for the State Library of Pennsylvania. And today we're really happy to announce the initiation of a new historical collection and collaboration devoted to telling the story of African-American history in central Pennsylvania, centered especially around the Old Eighth Ward and the community that is celebrated in the new Commonwealth Memorial near 4th and Walnut Street. The new partnership and the collection, which Michael is going to talk about more in a minute, grew out of conversations held between Messiah University Humanities faculty, individuals of the Commonwealth Monument Project, and the staff of the State Library over the last year and a half. We had these conversations because we saw three different community needs here. First of all, there's a need to preserve and make accessible the collective research of Harrisburg's historic African-American community, carried out as part of the Commonwealth Monument Project, and even broader than that. Over the last 2 years, faculty and students at Messiah University, as well as community historians of the Commonwealth Monument Project, have gathered hundreds of primary and secondary resources. The Digital Harrisburg website has provided a good place to host some of these resources for the short term, but the State Library is going to help us provide a longer term home, a more stable home. And I'm specifically referring to, the work, especially that we carried out for the 100 Voices, which if you don't have a copy, you can get a free copy online. Just go to digitalharrisburg.com, or you can just Google 100 Voices, Harrisburg's Historic African American Community. And this is a guide to the 100 men and women listed on the monument. Okay, the second need is that the new collection fulfills a need to preserve local genealogical work surrounding Harrisburg's historic African American community. About a year ago, Mr. Caleb Jackson Jr., I think will be here later with us, and Dr. Sharon Williams contacted the Digital Harrisburg group about preserving the findings and the records of local genealogists who are researching the histories of their ancestors. So we started conversations with the state library about the possibility of the library receiving some of these records. And so our collaboration grew out of that. Finally, it's clear that there are important resources at the state library itself, which that are related to Black history in central Pennsylvania that we hope can be made accessible through this collection. These include, for example, local historical newspapers, such as the Home Journal or the State Journal and the Stilton Press, as well as books about African-American history in its rare books collection. And so our collaboration grew out of an interest in digitizing these resources and making them publicly accessible. And so now I'm going to turn over the mic to Michael Lear to discuss this partnership from the perspective of the State Library.
Okay, thank you, David. And thank you, Lenwood, for inviting us today to participate in this panel. To give a little background on the State Library, we were formally created by an act of the legislature in 1816. And our mission grew through time not only to serve as a resource to the legislature, but other state agencies, and eventually to the public as a major research library by, about, and for all Pennsylvanians. Our collection strengths include genealogy, law, and Pennsylvania newspapers. We are very excited to participate in this community partnership and preserve this important history of Harrisburg and African Americans, as this proposed collection matches our long-term goals to diversify collections in order to appeal and be relevant to today's audiences and interests. Preserving the perspective of ordinary people, especially in the community, is important. Aside from genealogical collections, as a legacy, broad general interest collection, ours has perhaps been too focused on traditional big names and events in history and not local community history as much. We wish to change this. Second, our goal is to diversify the types of materials that we have in the library, especially adding unique primary sources and unpublished materials in physical or digital form, both born digital and digitized materials for wider accessibility. The State Library's collection has traditionally been almost exclusively consisting of published in print resources. And as we know, those aren't consulted as much, due to lack of convenience and access. To present and preserve these collections, State Library plans to implement an appropriate digital repository that will be freely accessible to the public online for digital and digitized materials. Physical materials will be preserved in the climate-controlled rare collections facility. The proposed African Americans in Central Pennsylvania collection, especially the old 8th Ward work of Digital Harrisburg, as we have heard about, has enormous potential to inform historical and social studies of social justice, socioeconomics, ethnicity and race, and urban development. In fact, our building is on the site, that area of the complex, of the Capitol complex east of the Capitol building, was the old 8th Ward neighborhood, and our building, the Forum building, is on the site of some of that neighborhood. In addition to being a community research resource, we also are excited that the collection may provide a hands-on teaching opportunity for history students, especially those interested in public and academic history careers, as well as those interested in what are called GLAM careers, galleries, libraries, archives, and museums careers. As David mentioned, Messiah University history students will identify relevant undigitized materials in the State Library's collections that relate directly to the goals of the Digital Harrisburg Project, and will be given the opportunity to digitize, describe, and upload these documents to our digital repository, working with myself and the digital collections librarian. In addition, there might also be opportunities for creating special digital and physical exhibits featuring materials from these collections. While there's been much uncertainty the last year. The State Library looks forward to receiving donations to the collection that fit in the scope and focus of the collection: African American genealogy and history in central Pennsylvania, Harrisburg, and the old 8th Ward neighborhood of Harrisburg. And again, I'd like to thank Lenwood for inviting us to participate in this program. Thank you.
Michael, we're excited. The library is on the site of the old Bethel AME Church's second location in Harrisburg, which was at Short Street at that time. So your footprint is your new. The current building is on the footprint of the old 8th Ward. You're in limbo now in construction. Could you give us a bit of an update before we go to our next speaker about when the library will be open again to the public? And forgive me, I'm assuming that we minimize the whole pandemic notion, but when is the reconstruction supposed to be?
Also, we haven't heard is our temporary locations in the Keystone building in the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission library space. And we haven't heard about returning on site for that to be opened up. We've been assisting people remotely as we can. And the Forum building renovation is a 2-year project. It commenced this past January. And so we hope to be in there, by spring of 2023 in a much improved space, since the building had grown functionally obsolete, having not really been touched since 1931.
So you'll be on one end of Walnut Street, and the proposed and in progress Thomas Chester Welcome Center and Research Center will be on the other end. I just would like to thank both of you gentlemen for creating an interdisciplinary and an intergenerational program. So many students who were not necessarily interested in history, who were lovers of social media and web and digitization, have actually fallen in love with this history. And some of the youngest people in David's program have embraced some of the oldest names in history on the monument site. We look forward to those young people bringing 19th century history into the 21st century. So thank you very much, gentlemen. And we will, I would take a P.T. Barnum moment, Dr. Pettigrew, and push the book again right before we end. But I thank you for timing you very, very busy.
Great to be with
schedule. You. I live on the ridge of a hill that overlooks what will become the new Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith house, so I can see that building from my rooftop. Is one of the really many incredible projects of Lancaster history. And we have Robin Surratt. Robin Surratt or Surratt?
Surratt.
Surratt. Robin Surratt, who is the vice president of Lancaster History, with us here to talk about their very exciting digitization project of their African American collective. Yes, ma'am, welcome.
Thank you so much. Thanks for inviting us to join this group. And it's really an honor to hear everyone else's projects. I'm excited to see how we can link up and maybe join together in some collaborative ways. So glad to be part of this roundtable today. I have some slides. If Amanda wants to throw them up on the screen, I thought I would just very quickly orient folks to who we are, and then I'll tell you just quickly about this grant we've been lucky to receive and a few minutes worth on the Thaddeus Stevens, Lydia Hamilton Smith project. For those of you not familiar with our organization, Lancaster History, formerly known as the Lancaster County Historical Society, now contains what you see in front of you, this lovely modern campus of history. In the next slide, you get a chance to see that we are inside that building doing a host of public programs, public-facing exhibitions, interpretive work. Our new facility really has broadened our capacity to deliver for our community in a variety of ways. On the next slide, you'll see a little bit more of the traditional historic house museum work that we do as we steward the home of President James Buchanan over at Wheatland. This is actually on our campus of history. So we share an 11-acre site for the Historical Society, our research center, and Wheatland. And we are, I think, 70 years younger than David and Michael's organization. We've been around since 1886 as an institution. So we've been collecting since that moment. And on the next slide, you'll get just a snapshot inside what is our research center. Our library and archive contains over 2 million documents, manuscripts, books, research resources that we do our utmost best to make available to the public. But of course, that access is only as good as either access to the facilities or access to the material. And so while access to our facilities has been limited over the last 14 months, we've really been able to double down on our efforts to create the access to materials, which, as with the rest of us, has been an ongoing process. With 2 million documents, you chip away slowly and surely. But we were fortunate to receive our second PHMC HARC grant, so the Historic and Archive Records Care Grant category. We had one 2 years ago that enabled us to digitize all of our Buchanan materials. This grant, which we just learned about maybe a month ago, will allow us in August to begin digitizing our African American history collection, all related to Lancaster County. So with that grant and with that project, we will have about 4,000 items digitized by I think May 2022 is our end date. And the items that we'll digitize as part of this project kind of fall, well, they really do fall into two principal categories. One is specifically related to the history of African Americans in Lancaster from the 18th century till today. And the second subcategory is related to Congressman Thaddeus Stevens. The former, the first category, includes records of enslaved persons in Lancaster County, records of free and freed men and women of color before 1850, bills of sale, correspondence, letters from abolitionists, Civil War records, apprentice indentures, anything that we can begin to tell a story from. I think our earliest records in this collection date back to 1765. And there's a lot of miscellaneous ephemera that has been housed in disparate collections within our archive. So to be able to pull them together in one repository that we can link and possibly even link with some of these partners is a really exciting opportunity. And actually, if you show the next two slides, Amanda, of course, the tricky thing with trying to show you images of all of these materials is that we haven't digitized them yet. So I have here, and then on the next slide, just a sampling of some of the materials that we'll be working on in the coming months. Connecting to our second collection is this letter on the left, which is from Lydia Hamilton Smith to one of the nephews of Congressman Thaddeus Stevens. She's writing from Washington, D.C. in 1861, kind of chastising the nephew for not getting in touch with and visiting her uncle. So it has a very contemporary feel about communicating with relatives. But on the next slide, what I can begin to just share with you is a little bit of information about our project to develop the Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith historic site into a museum. The next two slides give you kind of, here's one first of our friends, Mr. Stevens and Ms. Smith, who will be the centerpiece of this museum, which will include an historic recreation of some interior spaces, as well as interpretive galleries behind and below the home in which they both lived and at different times both owned. On the next slide, this is what it looks like today. It is a shell. It's encased and surrounded by the Lancaster County Convention Center. It was at risk of demolition some 15 years ago, but was preserved by a stalwart group of preservationists and Lancaster's Historic Preservation Trust. The exteriors were renovated. On the next slide, you can also see, you're looking into the Lancaster County Convention Center in those windows up on the left, but on the right, you see the remnants of an archaeological excavation that took place as these two properties were being preserved while the convention center was going up. In our efforts to restore these two homes and tell this story, we are working with a team we're just really starting to assemble, but it includes the exhibition design team from Ralph Applebaum Associates out of New York. And the last few slides, I just have a couple of their very early renderings on some ways in which we might be able to transform this space into a celebratory, exciting, just a transformative opportunity to share the legacy of Congressman Stevens and the entrepreneurial life of Lydia Hamilton Smith, who was one of 3 Black women business owners in Lancaster County in the decades that she lived here. So if you want to go through the next 3 slides, here we just show you some ideas on how we might be able to create interpretive space and use some of these newly digitized documents that we'll have at our disposal at the end of this grant project. And hopefully in this space, this is our last slide, we'll really be able to create a resource, a space in which the community can come together, African-American family history research can be conducted, neighborhood engagement can really be a centerpiece. So we're just looking forward to making this something that, as Linwood looks out over his view toward the site, as well as the rest of the neighborhood, it's something that Lancaster is really proud of and able to share with the nation in, I think, a really meaningful and impactful way.
Robin, this is really wonderful. Congratulations on your PHMC grant. Our history detectives are ceaseless about their hunt for information. One evening, somewhere around 1:30 in the morning, they began to buzz with excitement about finding an article in the newspaper where Frances Ellen Watkins Harper came to Lancaster to speak at City Hall, but could find no lodging. And so Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith had Frances speak stay at their home while she was in her sojourn here.
Wow.
That was an exciting piece. They also found that Frances Harper had taken over for a time the newspaper of William Goodrich in New York. And while she was the publisher of that newspaper, she had done articles about Thaddeus speaking in New York. And so we're excited about piecing this history together like a crazy quilt. One other thing which I feel I must point out in all of the slides is that if we were able to spend the time to go back and look at the slides, you would find a disabled person in each slide. And the museum and the Lancaster history are really bringing the story of Thaddeus Stevens' challenges and disabilities forward as part of the shaping of the whole man. And I really applaud you for that interpretation. It's a subtle piece that our guests may have missed in some of the renderings, but it's a really important piece.
It really is, and I appreciate very much you bringing that up, because that's going to be such a central part of how we go about designing this project.
Yeah.
I'm dropping my email address into the chat because we actually have a second program going on this evening. So I would love to hear from folks who have an interest in this project or any of your history detective discoveries. So please feel free to reach out to me at any time.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Good luck with your second program. And I really appreciate you and Tom Ryan. And Lancaster History has been a major funder of the Monument Project. So we appreciate the generosity of your gift to us also. Be well and enjoy your evening. Thank you so much. And I've been raving about those history detectives that we call. We have 2 groups, one in Harrisburg called the History Detectives and the other in Lancaster, who are studying the history of Maud Coleman, and we refer to them lovingly as the Maud Squad. But we will now have the hunt for Thomas Chester in the newspapers of the day. And if Caleb Jackson has not joined us yet, which I don't believe he has. Caleb, are you there? Brian and Kim, could I have you present the first of your 2 articles? We'll have Brian present his first article. Eric Jackson present his second article, and Kim present her article, and then we will come back if Caleb has joined us by then. Brian Williams, history detective.
Good afternoon. This is Brian Williams and Kimberly, and we're excited that we can be part of this Live and Learn series about T. Morris Chester. We were tasked to locate some unusual articles within the newspapers pre-Civil War and even after that on T. Morris. There's so much out there that's so exciting, and we're limited in a short amount of time that we can present this. So Kim and I, that's my wife, found two, and perhaps Ashley can bring the Yorkville Enquirer one up, the newspaper article.
First article, Chester 1.
It may be difficult for you to see there, but the date of this, and again, this is regarding T. Morris Chester, it's the Yorkville Enquirer, York, South Carolina, September 16th, 1858. And the heading is The Colony of Liberia. For those people that aren't familiar with T. Morris Chester, he was a resident of Liberia for many years, and then coming back to the United States. But in this article, from what we can make out, apparently 500 of the freedmen in this article listed who established the colonies in Liberia had been recaptured by slavers, sent to the United States, and then returned again back to Liberia. In an article with T. Morris Chester, a reporter from the New York Intelligencer, not in this article, but this is where it's claimed that it would be inhumane to send these men back into the hands of the new oppressors to be sold again and again. Chester asserted that the colonists had exterminated the slave trade in the colonized areas and had established industrious and thriving communities. Chester also explained that one individual from the colonized community had been elected to the Liberian House of Representatives. He further explained that the underage children were bound out to responsible individuals and taught a trade, taught to read and write. When these children became of age, they were given $12 and 5 acres of land in Liberia. So our synopsis on this was, we found it surprising that Chester was still defending colonization for two reasons. At the time of the article, of course, this is 1856, the African colonization issue had become increasingly controversial due to the growing abolitionist movement at the time. And number two, many African Americans at the time felt that they had a right to stay in the United States and not go there, even though it may have been better grounds for them to survive and live. So that's where we're at with the colony, and this issue here brought in the York Enquirer dated 1856. We know we don't have a lot of time. If there's any questions out there, you can wait until the end of our fourth presentation regarding T. Morris Chester as well. But we found this article very compelling in light of many of the issues that were going on at the time with the abolitionist movement and those that wish to stay and not go to Liberia, for those that are not familiar with that process back in the time.
And of course, Brian, this article with regard to our last speaker, 1856 to 1860, is the period of Buchanan as being president of the United States, and this constant conversation about, if we free the enslaved, where do we put them? Where do they go? And there were several movements and thoughts about this. Thank you. We'll come back to your, could I ask you, how did you find this article?
I should say my wife did most of the research on that. She spent weeks trying to locate some unusual articles. There's so much written about T. Morris Chester. This one in particular.
In the newspaper.
But it was in the newspapers.
Newspapers.com.
Newspapers.com.
Thank you very, very much. And you found so many articles. We could only share 2 tonight. But let's go to Eric Jackson, educator, interpreter, who also portrays Thomas Morris Chester in our Living History Company, but is one of our principal history detectives. And good evening, Eric, to you. You found a very, very interesting article. And would you share the article and your process and your thoughts?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Professor Sloan. This article comes from the Harrisburg Telegraph. As we know, Thomas Morris Chester worked for them around the time of the Civil War. It's dated October 7th, 1870. And this was a secondary find through the archives of none other than Caleb Jackson, actually. But the title of the article from October 7th, 1870 is simply entitled An Eloquent Address to the Colored Voters. And the secondary title is At the Great Mass Meeting of the Colored Citizens of Harrisburg, October 4th, 1870. And so this was, of course, 3 days later. And the article is very interesting because to me, it parallels some of the upcoming elections in Harrisburg in particular. So it's interesting that it's following a wave of political, what should I say? It follows a wave of political interest that we have now. So I'll just what I'd like to do is read just a couple of excerpts because it's a long article, and then just give you a little bit of review or interpretation of that. So he begins at this great mass meeting, and he talks about, he says, I tender my unqualified acknowledgments to the sterner sex. I cannot weave my words into garlands of admiration for the ladies who are here with their inspiring presence. And with that those two sentences, what jumped out at me is that this is kind of I believe Dr. Foreman mentioned earlier, this is kind of a prophetic word with regards to women eventually getting the right to vote. Of course, that was 50 or so years later, 1920, with the 19th Amendment. However, just that he was speaking about this, the importance of women, I thought was very interesting. And then he goes on further to say, he says, to be welcome as a counselor and as an exponent of your sentiments to the newly enfranchised citizens of Harrisburg. And he can say that because, as we know, 1870 was when the 15th Amendment was ratified. And so he's speaking to them, and then he goes on to talk about how he was born and raised in Harrisburg, how he saw the fire in Cumberland Valley, speaking about, of course, his being involved with the U.S. colored troops and going down with the Army Potomac, going down to Washington, D.C. area and to Richmond. So he's doing almost like a politician would do. I'm from here, and I know the landscape, I know what you've gone through, and I'm here to rectify that. And of course, just to add a footnote, Thomas Morris Chester had gone to Liberia. He had spent time in Europe. He had met with a variety of people in Europe, and then getting his barrister or his law degree in 1870 at Middle Temple in England. So he had a lot of experience where he had seen different things going on politically, both abroad and here, and he wanted to bring some of that back to his hometown. And just finally, I'll mention that there's one scholar says that as he went to the Avery College before going to Liberia and finishing at Thetford Academy in Vermont, it says that at the Avery School, it was taught and the belief that education would improve race relations. And we know that his parents very much wanted Thomas Morris Chester to have an elevated education. and they made a way for him to do that. And he used that to his advantage, again, going to get his law degree, coming back to the States, and then even having an impression down in Louisiana as a state superintendent and an officer in the militia. And finally, Chester says in that article, I have rejoiced at its prosperity and saddened at its adversity. And while I exalt over the glory which its representative men have attained, I have commiserated those who have betrayed their trust and forfeited public confidence. In common with our people, I have suffered all the prescription and prejudice which a haughty democratic city and a Negro-hating community could inflict. And again, he alludes to the fact that he had been, he both raised troops here in Harrisburg, Camp Curtin area, but he also led a group of 100 men, U.S. colored troops. So he was on the front line. He speaks about that. And so he, if he was to run for public office, I'm sure that he would have had a lot of support from the local African-American citizens of that time. So the article is very much on parallels, I would say 2021 politics. The only difference is that this Democratic, it was a switch. So back then, or now it would be the Republicans versus the Democrat, because we know that that changed after the Civil War in terms of those that would speak on behalf of African-American people. And at that time, it would have been Republicans. So it's a very interesting article. And I think it's, although it was written in 1870 or given as a speech in 1870, it very much parallels what we see locally in politics and to a large degree, what we see nationally in the past of this new presidential election. So,
and how did you find the article?
Again, as I opened up, I said it was a secondary find through the other history detective, Caleb Jackson. But it comes from the Harrisburg Telegraph.
That's
which again, Thomas Marsh Chester worked for them, you know, prior to the Civil War.
And what is interesting, Eric, is that at that speech, Chester speaks about the vote, the 1870 15th Amendment as an act of reparation, because African-American men who owned land voted until the 1838 Pennsylvania Convention. They lost the vote in 1838, and it took them to 1870 to get that vote back. And so Chester speaks at the end of that about this sense of an act of reparation of finally, his family were amongst the people who had actually had the right to vote until the Constitution. I think it's important for us with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act to realize how fragile the vote is. And if it was lost, then it could be lost again. And there's still a great work to do. Thanks a lot, Eric.
And of course, we know that he was working along with his contemporary, Octavius Cato, who was killed the following year. So there was a lot of momentum going on during this time, at least for the year prior to and the year after.
And these men were stitched together. Thank you. That's a really important piece of this crazy quilt for us to stitch together these articles. We have a third article that we'll share before we go to our guests who did deeper immersions. And Brian, would you like to share you and Kim's?
Yes. To follow up on our end, we talked about the Frederick Douglass marriage. This article, which is dated 1884, if you can.
Yes, February 4th, 1884. Are you still with us?
5. So T. Morris Chester has been everywhere, written speeches and all that. This one's kind of interesting, we thought. Kim actually found this one. It's out of the Harrisburg Daily Independent, February 2nd, 1884, headed Frederick Douglass's Marriage. We all know who Frederick Douglass was, the great man that he was, and how it was regarded by one of his own race. So in response to a reporter's initial inquiry, T. Morris Chester initially stated
to a white woman.
We've lost you again. Brian, you're going in and out. I'm gonna hope that he pops back in, friends.
associates in Washington thought that
Brian,
yes.
We lost you for a while. So would you repeat what you just said?
Let me start back up. This is in response to a reporter's initial query. T. Morris Chester initially stated that Douglass was his good friend, and he did not feel like discussing Douglass's personal right in the choice of a wife who was white, which is every man's right. In response to additional questions, Chester stated that he and his associates in Washington thought that Mr. Douglass obviously did not believe that the women of his own race were his equal. Chester added that there were many women in Washington who were just as accomplished, attractive, and fit to mingle in any society. Consequently, Chester felt that Mr. Douglass was a failure as an educator of his race, and that the happiness of his marriage was not yet to be seen. Pretty interesting. In conclusion, Chester stated that it's a subject upon which I would rather think than talk. We read this article about 4 times back and forth, my wife and I, and it's our belief that we think that Chester was very politically saying that Douglass may have made a mistake that made him look bad to his own race. Thus, the article that was written in the Harrisburg Daily Independent, for which he was trying to cover that thought process that Douglass may have had.
Well, it's a very interesting article, Kim and Brian, in that it is at the height of the 1876 to 1896 Black Power movement, and also the I'm Black and I'm Proud movement, also at a time where the American minstrel stage was instituting coon songs, which were really to diminish and degrade freemen in urban societies. Also in 1879, the United States gets the first miscegenation laws. Until 1879, the marriage of interrace was referred to as amalgamation. After that year, it is referred to as miscegenation, which is outlawed, and 31 states have laws until Love versus Virginia. And so Douglass is right on the controversy here. Chester, being a Victorian gentleman, also says this is not something that we really should be talking about. Yes, very, very interesting article, food for thought in our history circle. Thank you very much. We're sorry that we didn't get Caleb Jackson's piece. His piece was about Thomas Chester speaking to the Library Company of Philadelphia, but we'll have to add that to the public records. The history detectives were asked to go deep, quick into the records of newspapers and try to begin to pull out some profiles of how the public felt about Chester. Our other historians and colleagues were asked to make deeper immersions. And we began with asking Barbara Barksdale, one of our history detectives, if she would make an immersion into our own Dauphin County Historical Society, which is just 2 blocks from where Chester's family had their oyster bar and 3 blocks from his mother's house where he died, and see how he was measured at home by the things that we could find in that collection. Good evening, Barbara.
Good evening, Linwood and
Would
everyone.
you share your findings and all the things you found and the things you didn't find, and
Oh,
also your process?
well, thank you. Did you get my, oh, there it is. Yes, you did get it. Great. Okay, well, you had tasked me with the assignment of going to the Dauphin County Historical Society and taking a look at what they have down there in their files. I talked to Ken, which is Kenneth Frew, F-R-E-W, and he pulled out the two manila envelopes, folders, if you will, that contained a bit of information. Almost everything within that folder for Thomas Morris Chester was copies. Everything was copies of newspaper articles that, in fact, some of them were placed in there not only by myself, but also by Caleb Jackson over the years, since we have been really digging into the life of Thomas Morris Chester as well as Jane Marie Chester. So it was a little bit disappointing, but not necessarily a thing where you felt like, I was looking for a lot more because of the time period of trying to find his life and over the years from the 1800s. He was just another person in the city of Harrisburg. They weren't really trying to track him. They weren't looking at what he would become as a notable person in the future. So therefore, a lot of his information on he as well as his family was not truly archived. And it definitely is not archived at the Historical Society. At the next screen, there is what I had also in my collection of information that I have been dealing with for years, because I portray Jane Marie Chester in the reel out there with the history detectives as well as the past players, that I had this beautiful picture, I think it's beautiful, of General T. Morris Chester. So I just had to throw this in here out of my own collection. This is not down at the Dauphin County Historical Society, but I will make them a copy and make sure that it gets into his folder for everybody in the future. And the one thing that I can glean from this is the fact that he was a stenographer. There is an article that I had read a while ago where he actually was taking shorthand so that he could write quickly and tell his story, or tell the stories that he was grabbing from or during the Civil War, so he could write it and document it and get it into newspaper articles or newspaper publishers. Next screen is, like I said, what I found down there out of the two. And I took a picture of every single paper so I can send them to you later on. And there's only 39 items. And then there was in the two folders to combine 39 items. And again, it was all copies of copies. And it's kind of sad, but it is. Anyway, I did find this one here that was dated 1862, and it says in the shorthand part of it, Thomas Chester, a colored man, April of 1862. So it's actually appropriate because we're talking about this in April of 2021. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, you can't really read this. It's so, and this is a good copy of what they had on file. It's a letter from Thomas Morris Chester, and it was, they tell me that they actually have a real copy, but it was not pulled out to be seen. I don't know where it's really located at. So I'm not going to try to read this because it would hurt your eyes, but I'll send it to you so maybe someone can blow it up and put it in a folder with everything else that you're collecting. Can we go to the next slide, please? All right, and this is another copy of something that was down there at the Historical Society, and it is written from Thomas Morris Chester, or T. Morris Chester, attorney and counselor at law. This one is dated 1874, and it's actually written to, I believe, the way it's written, and I've read it several times, to his wife, and it says, your welcome letter from the 22nd of February was duly received. Basically, as it goes on, he's asking for her to send him some, about some gloves. He's asking about, sending money. He's talking about loving and caring, and he's showing that tender side of himself as being a man and having a relationship with, you know, the opposite sex here. He's also talking about a child, which many, in some cases, in some, I think it was read somewhere else that it was Maria. So it's a little bit of an exploration that we really need to dig into to find out, or maybe it's already found, that about his woman, Annie, as well as the daughter that he's referring to, because it says, ask her if she loves her papa. Tell her papa loves her and is anxious to see her. And he's asking, what does she look like? I foresee she looks more like you than me. So that means, in reading that, it's like a big hint that he's referring to his own child, which I thought was really, really nice. And again, it's talking about how, what I'm getting from, it's almost like a love letter, you know, and you don't get to see that when you're looking at it in the newspaper sense and articles that's been written about him. It's really getting into that emotional part of him being away from his family, watching his child grow up, and just being that husband or that man of the house. You know, I'm doing what I need to do over here, but I'm still thinking about you over there. I thought it was very touching and very nice. And over here on the other side, can we go to the next slide, please? This one is from 1873. I guess I should have had that one first and the other one second. But again, this one's going to Annie, and he's still down in New Orleans, as you would say, Linwood, right? New Orleans.
Yes,
Okay. Hey, you know, I'm going to be going there soon, so come on down. Maybe while I'm down there, I can do some more research on Thomas Ward Chester and go to his, at least a block that he lived in, you know?
yes.
But again, this one is to Annie. And he said, I wrote to you some 10 days ago. So God, I guess he would love to have some really good email right about then, huh? And sent you a bill of exchange for 25 shillings. 25 shillings. They weren't even using the terminology dollars, you know, at the time because of the time period and where he was living at, the shillings. And this note in the form of a bill of exchange, and you would earnestly request that you send me another pair of gloves. Those gloves that he was talking about throughout this thing, is like, they must have been extraordinary. I wish we could find a pair of those gloves. And he's asking for his size. He wants an 8.5 is my size. And she can pick out the color that she wants for her man, okay? And he's telling her, don't entrust this to anyone else to purchase them. But, you know, for you, select them yourself. And he's, well, I'm still the man of the house, even though I'm not there. And I'm telling you what you need to do with this money. Get my size, but you can pick out the color and don't let anybody else do that. And this is where I'm referring to as the child. And maybe it's because it's trying to interpret what he really was writing in his calligraphy mind here. But it's saying Marie here, but it's also in parentheses, it says many, because we're really not sure. So maybe somebody with a better eye will be able to determine exactly what the child's name was, truly was, you know. And again, he's talking about, you know, has she grown, you know, what is she looking like? And it's just wonderful to see this part of it. He's not that Civil War correspondent. He's not being that true attorney. He is being a man that a woman would like to have, you know? So
this is a very interesting find. This is a Victorian gentleman, and
yes.
a Victorian gentleman had to have 3 sets of gloves on him at all times. He had to have his traveling gloves, which could be any color, and that he could match up to his day clothes or his riding clothes.
Mm-hmm.
He had to have a pair of white linen gloves for eating in a formal setting. Gentlemen didn't take their gloves off when they ate. And he had to have a pair of white kid gloves for the ballroom and the dance hall when he extended his hand or his hand to a gentleman or his arm to a lady. And so these gentlemen wore their gloves out a lot. This is an interesting find about his personal, everything we've seen about him, Barbara. he's immaculately dressed, and
Mhm.
so he must have been meticulous about it.
Well, just even looking at that very first picture that I showed you, he looks so stalwart and nice and, well groomed and kept, and his beard is trim, is something like yours there, Linwood, So he's looking pretty good there, But to go back to our beautiful little love letter here, it obviously is after Christmas that he had written this letter, and he's talking about again the child, and Christmas was rather dull, and then he actually gives her an apology for not sending anything in time, any money to help purchase a present for the child, and also probably for her. So it's just showing the more human side, the manly side. I am still here for you, and you're there for me. Get me some gloves, and I'm thinking about you and loving you too. So I thought that was really nice. And going on to the next thing here. All right, and I just had to throw this in here, like I mentioned earlier about Jane Marie Chester, which was his mother. So Thomas Morris Chester could not be anything without his mom. And I have to just say, kudos to Jane Marie Chester. She was a phenomenal, wonderful woman. She came out of her slavery moments too. She came up to Pennsylvania. She married George, and she and George had a restaurant, and that's where little Thomas was running around and being underfoot. And she was working for an attorney, and she was able to get Thomas some education, as well as her other son, David, and her daughter, who became a school teacher. So Thomas grew up in a very good environment, even though it was hard times for people of color. Miss Jane Marie Chester, or in here it refers to her as Aunt Jane Chester, she still had to do something. She supported her husband, George, in the restaurant business. They sold oysters and they got wild game, and they were doing everything for the people at the Capitol to make sure that they were fed from their restaurant. They did that catering. But these people also, as Thomas would, if he could talk to you, they were abolitionists. They were the people that was helping those freedom seekers. So this is all part of molding that man called Thomas Morris Chester, in order for you folks to actually be researching him, because she is the reason why he is or was the way he was. That's all I can say about my girl, Jane Marie Chester. She's awesome. She was an awesome lady. And then we go to the last slide here. And that is, and I could talk all day long, Linwood. So, I'm so glad you gave me 10 minutes, I'm probably over it by now, right? But I found this other story, which was obviously placed in the Pennsylvania Historical Museum Commission booklet from 1993. And, it's just copies of that's in the file. And it's obviously noting the plaque that was put up there in front of the Whitaker Center, honoring Thomas Morris Chester. And the reason why it was there is because that's where Jane and George had their restaurant at one time. So
Barbara,
yes.
a couple of things.
Yes.
First of all, we will want in our history detective sessions, and I'm looking forward to the time when we can do them right around the table in real time. We want to lay this article about Thomas Chester's personal life and his relationships next to that article that Kim and Brian felt about Thomas Chester and how he felt about Frederick Douglass's personal life. Have some conversation about giants and real men,
all right. Yeah.
We'll want to do that. Secondly, I will not do an editorial on why our own historical collection only has 39 pieces.
Yeah.
Such a brilliant man. But rather than taking the negatives, maybe we can begin to expand their collection with the things that the history detectives find and place and increase not only their cultural competency, but the assets and the resources that they have in that collection. So I know you have 24 things, and David, Kim and Brian have found other things. So just this evening, we can double from 39 to 78 in their collection. And let's help them open some doors and windows in their own mind and increase their collection.
But
one final thing, Barb, is that
yes,
we all know Chester's Oyster House as the site where the Whitaker is now. But at the time that Abraham Lincoln visited in 1861, the Chesters had the Oyster House also in the Jones Hotel, where Lincoln made his escape via the port of Jacob Compton. So all these stories we gathered.
Right.
I've got to let you have the last word, and then I'd like to move to Momo Sinclair, who has been looking at one end of the state, and Samuel Black, who has been looking at the other end of the state to see the points and the tangents of Chester's reach in his journey. But last word, Barb.
Well, basically all I was going to say, and this is why it's so important that we not only gather the information on Thomas Morris Chester, but on all of the people that we know and don't know about that needs to be placed into these here places, archives, because a lot of our history has been covered up, thrown away, destroyed, or whatever. But as we find it, we need to collectively place it where it needs to be brought to the forefront. Okay.
Yes. And before we go to Philadelphia and to Pittsburgh, I would just like to let our friends from the library know that we did a little secret shopping of our own. And we sent Aaron Bomar, who portrays Jacob Compton, into the Dauphin County Library system to see what he could find in the library's collection about Thomas Chester. And welcome, Aaron. Have you left us, Aaron? While we're looking for him to share, let's go to Philadelphia to artist, playwright, historian, educator, and change agent Momo Sinclair, who went into the Charles Blockson collection.
I really, that was, wow, thank you for that list, Linwood, and thank you for inviting me to come and speak today. Because of coronavirus restrictions, I couldn't get into the Blockson, but I actually had a very interesting time with the collection through the catalog. So I'm going to be reading, as Linwood mentioned, I am a playwright and I think creatively, so the way I communicate is through essays and writing. So I wrote on something and I'll share that today. All right. As told by a website somewhere in the vast internet, the day the Union soldiers marched into Richmond, Virginia, a dispatcher from the newspaper, the Philadelphia Press, named T. Morris Chester, walked proudly into the city alongside the troops. Chester had been following the activities of the Black soldiers on the front line, keeping his eager readers updated with their every move. An African-American man born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, to a well-to-do family who participated in the local radical Black political discourse, Chester must have felt the sweltering of emotions as before him lay the fallen Confederacy. As the story goes on, Chester made his way to the State House where the legislative wing of the Confederacy carried out their day-to-day business. He entered a room where the House of Representatives had convened. He sat himself down at the speaker's desk. He took out his writing paraphernalia and began to pen his article, detailing the triumphant entrance of Black soldiers into the fallen Confederacy. His emotions can be understood by his choice of symbolism. Chester enters the story as a paranoid Confederate soldier walks by. Feeling the emotions of defeat, crestfallen, the soldier happened to look up and noticed the Black man sitting in what was a Confederate seat of power. The symbolism was too much. He started to harangue the reporter at his work. He was ignored. The insult was too much for the Confederate soldier. He ran in, ready to bodily remove the Black man from the throne. Chester stood up and swiftly punched him to the ground. The action in the story thickens with the entrance of a Union soldier. Believing him to be a brother in a different color uniform, the Confederate soldier appealed to the Union soldier to give him his sword so that he could ceremoniously hack Chester's heart out of his body. The Union soldier refused his request, volunteering instead to make an open space for the two men to have a fair fight. He also noted Chester's size, cautioning the Confederate soldier to lick his wounds and carry on. The soldier took his brother's advice. I cannot speak to the validity of this story. I did not fact check it. However, as a story, it struck me with its layered symbolism. In the story, Chester's character fits into the profile of the individual described in other historical recollections: dignified, proud, unyielding. These are words that the modern ear fights to hear when Black people are described. Even if this actual tale turns out to be just a tale, the very existence of T. Morris Chester, the first Black war correspondent in the United States, covering the lives of African-American soldiers and their efforts on the front line during the Civil War, is a brilliant story of a brilliant man who desired to live in a world where he could be a human in its fullness at a time when a Black man was supposed to conform to the insecurities of Black white supremacy. History, at its most elemental, is composed of the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves. From the days of cave people sitting around a fire to the present, one member of the community always stood and declared the history of how the people arrived in that location. What had to be fought for? What had to be overcome? What victories were won? Who were the heroes? Who or what were the antagonists? Who was lost along the way? How does understanding each of these characters help us understand the modern world that we live in? The historian digs through annals of Pete to piece together facts and explanations in order to give more details to the story. African Americans, because of the value that has been placed on our lives by a white supremacist system, have always found their stories not being told. This has an impact on the understanding that we have ourselves, as I've seen in my own life. T. Morris Chester is an active part of 19th century African American history. A lawyer, educator, and journalist, Chester appears as a prolific figure. Living during a prolific time as the question of slavery was being debated fiercely, he was raised in a family that was a part of the contemporary Black activism. His family owned a restaurant that circulated radical Black publication. Chester was afforded the best education. He studied abroad and made the country of Liberia a surrogate home, where he was politically active. I was asked to visit the Blackstone Library at Temple University in search of items that can tell the story of T. Morris Chester and his affiliation with the city of Philadelphia. I was to analyze these items, constructing the pieces of the story. The Blackstone Library is in possession of over 500,000 items that, as the website describes it, relates to the global Black experience. The library is the fruits of Charles Blackstone's labor to collect items relating to the stories of Black Americans. Housed on the Temple University campus, this library is an ideal place to locate details from the Black experience. My interest as an historian is based on my life as a storyteller and educator. As a writer, I write plays that explore the history of the Black existence in the Atlantic region in the world. I'm interested in stories. I'm always on the hunt for the stories that reveal who I am as a Black person and in turn pass on that knowledge to others. As an educator, I want to impart the ability to question the stories we tell and that we are told, especially for our younger learners, meaning K-12. One can understand that this project brought me joy. When I first heard about the Blackstone Museum, I was filled with awe. I felt that I again got to know myself as a Black person. The fruits of Mr. Blackstone's labor to acquire texts and items that document the Black existence in the Atlantic region have ballooned into a treasure for searchers of knowledge. Because of coronavirus restriction, I was unable to do physical exploration of the Blackstone Library. However, in our 21st century times, the internet is an ample resource. I spent some time looking at what had been cataloged in their system. They have written text and a photograph documenting the presence of T. Morris Chester's life on the earth. Philadelphia was one of the epicenters of Black activism during Chester's time. As noted this evening, he was a contemporary of Octavius Catto. However, when one goes in search of stories of his relationship to the city, it is limited. This was true of the Blackstone as well. Though this assessment is being made based on a catalog search as well as Google, many of the texts written on him talks about his time or his life as a journalist. By first glance at the history available, one sees his connection to his home city, Harrisburg, as well as the country of Liberia, which could be assumed to be a second home for him. However, from the stories that are told, it is apparent that Chester has connections to the city of Philadelphia. The stories that are told about Chester and Philadelphia are not readily available. These are the questions that I had put together to ask during this research. How did Chester participate in the Philadelphia political and social ecosystem? Who did he collaborate with in the city? Who were his antagonists? Where did he have influence? How does Chester's participation how does Chester's participation in the 19th century Philadelphia politics fit into the wider values of education and African-American autonomy that is exemplified in his life's work? What does Chester's participation in 19th century activism reveal about life in the city? In the Blackstone collection, there are a few books associated with Chester's life. There are collections of his war dispatches. One is titled Thomas Morris Chester, Black Wars Correspondent, His Dispatches from the Virginia Front, edited with a biographical essay and notes by R.J.M. Blackett. Chester wrote for the Philadelphia Press. The defunct newspaper's Wikipedia page lists Chester as a notable contributor. Chester was the first African-American war correspondent. The library also has clippings from African-American journalists. The description reads, the Blackstone clipping file is a collection of newspaper and magazine clippings, pamphlets, programs, brochures, and ephemera, all pertaining to aspects of the Black experience in Africa and throughout the diaspora. This folder is one of nearly 1,000 such folders available. I'm sure there are clippings and collections of dispatches in these collections that details some connection that Chester may have had to the city of Philadelphia. I'm intrigued by R.J.M. Blackett's biographical essay, which may have deeper details about how Chester got employed into his role at the Philadelphia, my apologies, I just lost my Philadelphia Press. However, I do not know if the clippings and dispatches will possess deeper insight into T. Morris Chester's life in Philadelphia, meaning where did he stay when he visited the city? How did his role at the newspaper register in the daily life of African Americans? There are also a few books with a general profile of Chester's life. There's a copy of Jesse Carney's book, Notable Black American Men. Some of these texts are profiles of war journals. Chester's speech, Negro Self-Respect and Pride of Race speech of T. Morris Chester Esquire of Liberia, delivered at the 29th anniversary of the Philadelphia Library Company, December 9th, 1862, is a transcript of his speech to the Library Company. There are different copies of this speech. It is also a part of the anthology, Pamphlets of Protest, an anthology of early African-American protest literature, 1790 to 1860, edited by Richard Newman, Patrick Reel, and Philip Lapskanky. I'm curious to read any commentary the authors offer about the circumstances around the speech. I'm also curious to read the speech itself. From the title, it fits into the narrative of Chester as an autonomous individual seeking an environment where he can have autonomy. There is a coverage of a journal named Freeman, which Library describes as a monthly magazine devoted to the interests of the freed colored people. There's an excerpt from the article. It reads, Mr. T. Morris Chester has arrived in England from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, US. Mr. Chester comes as a representative of the so-called Garnet League and is commended to the Friends of Freedom in this country by Governor Curtin and the other distinguished American gentlemen. This inscription interests me because A, I want to know of what is the Garnet League. B, I want to know Chester's relationship to Governor Andrew Curtin. Curtin was the governor of Pennsylvania from 1861 to 1867. He was a strong supporter of Lincoln during the Civil War. I'm interested in the nature of his and Chester's friendship or association. Overall, based on searches into their database, the Blackstone Library has information about T. Morris Chester's life as a war correspondent. However, based on its online catalog listing, it does not have any documents, objects, or ephemeras that gives deeper insight and details into Chester's social and political life in Philadelphia. I recommend that the text in the Blackstone be analyzed further after the coronavirus restrictions have been lifted to see if they possess any details about Chester's life in Philadelphia. However, I recommend that other institutions in the city be identified and explored to see if there are pieces of the puzzles out there in the ether. It would be interesting to see what the Library Company of Philadelphia possessed. Separate from this inquiry, I also recommend that Chester's speech to the Library Company, as well as some of his dispatches, be digitized and made available to the general public. As an educator, I understand the value of these stories of Black life on the battlefront for teaching younger generations. A Chester curriculum would be exceptional value to the American education system. The story of the first Black war correspondent in America, serving in a war that had deep consequences for the African-American life, needs to be told. Chester spent his stint as a reporter telling the stories of African-Americans fighting nobly for the cause of freedom and autonomy. His story needs to be surfaced and be added to the narratives that we're now telling ourselves about ourselves. Thank you.
Outstanding. Outstanding indeed. Thank you very much. So I want to know too, let's make that search together, So many questions. We are just beginning to raise these men up as icons, but they're also men who struggle to be both upright and stand upright. Questions you ask are very, very important. Some of those questions, Momo, about his power as an agitator in the best sense, can be answered by us asking Samuel Black on the other end of the state in Pittsburgh, where Chester went to study both at Avery and under his mentor, Martin Delaney. And we will make that loop through the passion of his speaking to Sam. But I'm also intrigued with this notion of him knocking somebody down, because we all learned that Chester is such a gentleman, it's in so much control of his this marks the third time. Usually if you hear the story 3 times, it's either from the same source or you begin to construct it. Let's hear from Samuel W. Black, and then we'll come back and we're going to go about 10 minutes over, good friends, the 6 o'clock hour, if you would stay with me, but we'll transition to Sam Black.
Okay. Well, good afternoon, everyone. And if you can put the slideshow on, is that possible? There you go. Yeah. So my talk in terms of Chester and Pittsburgh is going to be surrounded by some of the major events that were taking place amongst the Black communities in Pittsburgh, Allegheny, and Birmingham. For those of you who are not familiar with Pittsburgh history, Allegheny is now the north side of Pittsburgh, which was Allegheny City. At the time, Chester would have been there, and Birmingham is the south side of Pittsburgh today, which was Birmingham City and during Chester's day. But Thomas Morris Chester, as we all know and what we've talked about so far today, was a very interesting person, very well educated, very forthright in terms of his race consciousness, and that played out in all the endeavors of his life. So I'm going to focus a lot on what the main ideas and focus for Black folk in Pittsburgh during this period of Chester being there, and those people that he would have come in contact with, and those who have influenced some of the events and activities that he involved himself in after he left Pittsburgh. So in the 1850s, 60s, throughout the rest of his life. Next slide. So we're going to start with the Allegheny Institute that most of you probably know of as Avery College. And I start with the name Allegheny Institute because it was founded as the Allegheny Institute in 1849, and it would have been called the Allegheny Institute when an 18-year-old Chester would have arrived there beginning in 1851 as a student. And although that building there is not the actual building from 1851, that is Avery African Methodist Episcopal Church, which the Allegheny Institute sort of morphed into. And that building was built later, quite later on, but was torn down in Pittsburgh to make way for Interstate 279. So as we know, a lot of Black communities across this country were flattened for the interstate. His teachers would have been Amelia Freeman, and we know of Amelia Freeman because she married Abraham Shadd from Canada and taught in Mississippi with her husband as he ran for political office in Canada, but she was also a Pittsburgher. And she not only was a student Allegheny Institute, but she also was one of the first Black women to attend and graduate from Oberlin College in Oberlin, Ohio. She came back to Pittsburgh for a short period, and that is probably the time that she would have had the opportunity to interact with Chester as he was a student there. She left Pittsburgh around 1854, and we find her in Cleveland in August of 1854, being part of the National Immigration Convention. And I'll talk a little bit about that later on, because that's very important, because as we know, Chester was very much interested in immigration to West Africa, and he actually did that. And so I'll put all that into context. As I mentioned, she taught, and then she moved to Chatham in 1856, and she was amongst the Americans that included Martin Delany, meeting at Delany's home with John Brown, as John Brown was recruiting to get support from Delany and others, former Americans who are now living in Ontario, trying to get their support to build his army for what eventually would be the raid on Harper's Ferry. And so Chester was also a classmate of AME Bishop, that's the African Methodist Episcopal Church Bishop, Benjamin Tucker Tanner. He wasn't a bishop at that time, but they were classmates at the Allegheny Institute. And as we know, Tanner is the father of the famous painter, Henry O. Tanner, and Henry O's sister, Hallie Taylor Dillon Johnson. And so next slide, please. So carrying on with the Allegheny Institute, one of his teachers at the Allegheny Institute would have been Martin Freeman. And Martin Freeman was a freeborn African-American who went to college in Vermont, and then moved to Pittsburgh and joined the staff of the Allegheny Institute. He later became president of Allegheny Institute before the mid-1860s, during the tail end of the Civil War. He decided to move to Liberia. So you're gonna see all these connections between Chester's going to Liberia and the time he spent in Liberia, and these other Pittsburghers going to Liberia as well. So it's almost like a highway between Pittsburgh and Liberia, going back and forth. But Freeman was, and he's no relation to, that I could find, to Amelia Freeman, but Freeman would later become president pro tem at the Liberia College. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. And of course, there's Bishop Benjamin Tucker Tanner on the right and Freeman on the left. Next slide. Now, the National Immigration Convention was this scheme of that included people from various states across the country who met for 3 days in Cleveland, Ohio in August of 1854 to discuss one thing and one thing only, to put a plan together for the immigration of African Americans out of the United States. And at that time, Africa was not the #1 destination. They were looking at Central America or Canada and the Caribbean. Africa was on the table, but it was not one of the primary choices of the group. You were not allowed to speak at this convention unless you were a proponent of immigration. The only person that I know of in terms of the record who was allowed to address the group, who was not a quote unquote proponent of immigration, was John Mercer Langston, who had welcomed the convention to Cleveland. One of Cleveland's longtime abolitionist leaders was not even allowed to speak on the floor. And of course, Frederick Douglass had criticized in his newspaper the immigration convention because it was looking at immigration, and Douglass was anti-immigration. Although when his life was on the line, he was also for immigration because he left the United States and went to Europe, right? So you get these sort of conflicting things, but you also get the debate about what is best and what is the path for African Americans to achieve equity and freedom and justice in this society. Even the Allegheny Institute was criticized by Frederick Douglass in his newspaper because he felt that having a college that was exclusive for African Americans was promoting separatism of the races, and that the college should follow along the lines of places like Oberlin College and Berea College in Kentucky, or Berea came on a little later, but Oberlin College that accepted both white and Black students into the college. But the Allegheny Institute had a different mission. And a lot of the teachers, as well as the students at the Allegheny Institute, joined the National Immigration Convention. As a matter of fact, the largest delegation that attended the convention came from Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. So after the Fugitive Slave Act, immigration interested Chester before and during his time at the Allegheny Institute. And a year before the Immigration Convention of 1854, Chester was already making his plans to immigrate to Liberia. And as we know from the earlier presentation from Mr. Williams and others, he did go to Liberia and had those experiences there. Chester was a student, as I mentioned, of Martin Freeman. Freeman was also a member of that delegation that attended the Immigration Convention in Cleveland. And Freeman would eventually migrate to Liberia on the urging of Martin Delany, where he served as professor at Liberia College. Now I want to explain just real quickly about Delany's connection here with Martin Freeman and with Chester. When Delany traveled in 1859 to what is today Nigeria to negotiate for land leases as part of his immigration scheme, he stopped in Liberia and he met in Monrovia with Edward Wilmot Blyden and Alexander Crummell. And Alexander Crummell was on his way back to the United States to raise funds and supplies and things for Liberia College. And they were trying to convince Delany to stay in Liberia and teach at Liberia College. Delany said no, but there are men in Pittsburgh who since you're going back to the United States, there are men in Pittsburgh that you will want to meet with. And one of those men was Martin Freeman. Now, the interesting thing is that Chester most likely was in Liberia at the time that Delany has stopped there. Now, I don't have any evidence in the historic record that they met with each other in Liberia, because that would be something to know, because we know that Chester was already working as a journalist in Liberia. So that would have served Delany very well in his immigration ideas. So the document you see on the right are the published proceedings of the National Immigration Convention of Colored People in Cleveland, and that is in the Heinz History Center collection. Next slide. Now, of course, Liberia. Chester returned to Liberia somewhere around 1856 and began to edit the Star of Liberia newspaper from this period. Again, this period, 1859 to 61, at the time Delany was there. I didn't have a chance to try to find the Star of Liberia paper to see if any of those issues still exist. It would have been great to see, and to see if there's any mention of Delany being in Liberia in those issues. And so, as you can see on the right, there's a map of the Atlantic coast of Liberia. It's kind of hard to see with all the small printing, but there are these settlements along the coast of Liberia as well. Now, the interesting thing that Chester, being a recruiter for the American Colonization Society, Delany could not stand the American Colonization Society. He did not want to, or he reluctantly accepted funds from the American Colonization Society that helped fund his trip to Africa. but he was not a supporter or a proponent of the American Colonization Society. And most African-American leaders by the early 1850s were not supporters of the American Colonization Society. Next slide. And then of course the Civil War, and we know of Chester's role during the Civil War as a war correspondent and a recruiter for the 54th and 55th regiments. We know that the Civil War was the game changer in the whole struggle for freedom. We know that the Civil War even made people like Delaney, who was living in Ontario after he returned, before and after he returned from West Africa. His home at that time was in Chatham in Ontario, Canada. But what brought him back to the United States was the Civil War. His intention and what he was doing before 1861 was he was recruiting for his Niger Valley Exploring Party. Those land leases that he was able to get with the Abeokuta in Yoruba land in Southwest Nigeria, what is today Nigeria, he was trying to recruit people to move to those lands. And then the Civil War changed the whole thing, and he had to put his whole immigration ideas to the side and devoted himself as a recruiter for the Union Army, as an agitator, along with Douglass and others, to try to get Lincoln, and this is before the Emancipation Proclamation, but try to get Lincoln to establish Black regiments to fight in the war. And we know what, we know what Douglass's opinions were and his famous quotes about giving a gun and a uniform with the brass buttons and so forth to a Negro, and what he would do in the war and everything. But Delaney, Chester, Douglass, and a number of others who were members of the abolitionist movement and leadership in abolitionist movement were recruiters for the US colored troops. And one of the things that I don't think is very clear in history is the fact that the US colored troop recruiters were not white men from the North. They were not Lincoln and those people from the Union Army. They relied on a network that already existed amongst Black abolitionists. And Dr. Foreman had already talked about those men who had been meeting in the Black Convention movement. All of that was not for naught. It was just not people coming together to meet. There was a real national network, political network that was developed. And that is what helped form these US colored troop regiments, and including the regiments in Massachusetts. So Delaney and Douglass's sons were some of the first recruits in the Massachusetts 54th Regiment. And as a sidebar, what I have found was that some of the classmates or some of the people that Chester knew for the short time that he was in Pittsburgh at what would become Avery College, the Allegheny Institute, also fought in the Civil War. Next slide. And this is George Vershon on the right. And George Vershon would have been a contemporary of Chester, a little older than Chester, more or less closer to Delaney's age than Chester's age. But he also served as president of Avery College for a short time. But we know that Chester got involved with the Pennsylvania Equal Rights League, and Vershon had attended some of those first meetings in early 1864 that formed the Pennsylvania Equal Rights League. And George Vershon was one of the leadership in Pennsylvania, along with William Nesbitt and later Henry Highland Garnett, when Garnett had moved to Pittsburgh in the early 1870s to succeed Vershon as president of Avery College. And it was then under Garnett's leadership that the Jubilee of Freeman parade was held in April of 1870 in recognition of the franchise being extended, or the 15th Amendment being ratified. And then there was a major parade throughout Pittsburgh, Birmingham, and Allegheny City along the three rivers to recognize that. So we can see the clash between Chester's interest and involvement and these Pittsburghers' interest and involvement, and especially during the time when he was a student at Allegheny Institute, where you can sort of put the pieces together and see that he was influenced by these people who were proponents of immigration, like Martin Freeman, like Martin Delaney and Amelia Freeman and so forth, that helped form some of his thinking and some of his, what we today we would call the Atlantic world or the Atlantic diaspora of people of African descent. I didn't call it that back then, but that's what they were doing. So you had this communication across the Atlantic between Pittsburgh and Liberia, Pittsburgh and Nigeria and so forth. They went on all the way up through the 1890s. And so Chester was there when all of this was being formed, when people were taking these major risks and taking these major life changes. The same thing that a freedom seeker would do, to remove themselves from bondage in Virginia and to escape through Pennsylvania and Ohio and sometimes make their way to Canada, but they may have settled in Detroit or in Michigan or Western Ohio or something like that. But those are major changes in their life cycle and major risks that they had taken to do that. And the same thing was here. I want to say one more thing before I close. Momo had mentioned R.J.M. Blackett. Blackett was an advisor to me on my From Slavery to Freedom project that dealt with a lot of this history of the Immigration Convention. And one of the things he told me was to be an abolitionist in the 1850s was akin to being a communist in the 1950s, because you didn't know who you were going to trust, who was going to turn you in, and what type of persecution you were going to face. So it was just that dangerous and just that secretive, you know, from the 1850s to the 1950s. So I believe that is my last slide, but I did want to point out some of the items in the Heinz History Center collection and kind of connect what was going on in Pittsburgh in the early 1850s when Chester was there and how that kind of evolved. Even when Chester left, he still followed the same path that these Pittsburghers were on.
Thank you so much, Sam. This is really, really a brilliant presentation. And it shows we think of these men as silos of thought, you know, and as isolated islands, but they are a weaving and a tapestry, you know, of that perpetual struggle for equity, parity, and justice, and their lives cross and crisscross each other. We see from east to west and north to south, Chester's life weaving through these men like Nesbitt, who is in Altoona, you know, Henry Highland, Garnett, who seems to be everywhere at once. We all claim him, and Chester, who's in at least 3 other places. In our next workshop, we will look at Chester in Baltimore, Chester in New York City with the Black Press, and Chester at the end of his life in New Orleans. But we'll have these last 10 minutes. Thank you all for allowing me to go over, where our friends, I'll end where I started, where our friends at the Dauphin County Public Library share the really exciting news about the development of the Thomas Chester Welcome Center and Research Library, which will be the future home of the Pennsylvania Pass Players and the host site for our subsequent years for our Live and Learn. So thank you, historians. I need to write a grant tomorrow morning so that we can all go away together for a weekend when the pandemic is lifted and really immerse ourselves in some of these wonderful things. In the meantime, we're going to deposit all your presentations, you know, if you allow us, with the Dauphin County library system. So all of your articles, your slides, and your PowerPoints enrich their collections. And maybe Barbara will help Kim Frew out too. So I'll turn now with great thanks and gratitude to our historians, to the colleagues at the Dauphin County Library System, to end our evening with the exciting presentation on the future of the project.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ellen Brown, and I'm here representing the Dauphin County Library System. My esteemed colleague and library board trustee, Laverna Fountain, unfortunately had to hop off at 6 o'clock. I can't speak nearly as eloquently as Laverna does, and I know she looks forward to meeting you all at some point in the future. But this is just such a wonderful opportunity for the library. The library recognized that the dedication of the Commonwealth Monument Project provided us with the opportunity to continue to tell the story of Thomas Morris Chester and other prominent African Americans who were significant in Harrisburg's history and beyond, so that their story doesn't end with a named space or the monument. And our commitment is to naming the new Welcome Center in a $3.5 million capital preservation project that will renovate the library and the adjoining Haldeman Haley House that we recently acquired. We're going to name the Welcome Center in recognition of T. Morris Chester's extraordinary life story, and also to create and maintain a living history of all the stories represented here today, as well as the others we find and create as we journey forward. Because really, in the end, we know that this is all about stories. It's this Lyceum this evening, stories were just so interesting and so moving. And I like to say that Dauphin County Library System would like to become the modern day Dewey Decimal Systems card catalog of all of Thomas Morris Chester's works and stories. And so with that, I think that, you know, the libraries like history expand and change through time, but excuse me, we recognize that everyone needs to be able to find and grow their own story. And our commitment today is that these stories, like the ones we have just heard, will continue to be told at our library and across the nation and the world. So what I thought I would do is ask Ashley if she would pull up a series of renderings that we have to share with you all that will show you the library as we envision it, the construction on, we envision it becoming rather, the construction on our project is going to begin the 1st of July of this year, and we expect to complete it in about a 14-month period of time. What you see on your screen now is a rendering that shows the Haldeman Haley House. There's a photograph that shows the Haldeman Haley House, and this was home to Sarah Haldeman Haley, who bequested the land on which the McCormick Riverfront Library sits. You can see that it was the garden to her house. It's to the left of the house. And upon her death, she donated that land to the library along with the funds to build the McCormick Riverfront Library as we know it today. And you can see from this rendering that there are some architectural challenges in joining these buildings, but we think that we've, with the assistance of Alexander Architects, the Alexander Group, we have some wonderful and exciting new plans to show you. Next slide, please, Ashley. This is a cutaway of the lower level of the library as it is going. It's a rendering, it's an imagination of how it's going to look. But if I could draw your attention to the brown space in the middle of the drawing, that is the heart of the library. It is the entrance by which everyone will enter and exit the library, and that is now going to be called the T. Morris Chester Welcome Center. Next slide, Ashley. You can see from these drawings, once again, at the top of your screen, folks will enter at the street level, come into the T. Morris Chester Welcome Center, and to your right will be a dedicated children's learning space. And to your left is going to be community space where the past players will be housed. And we are also envisioning this to be the home of the International Institute Through Peace Tourism Project. It will be the home base where visitors to Harrisburg, as well as residents, can come and get information about the monuments that have been dedicated towards peace and African American history in our city. And so that will be a central location for information as well there. You can see towards the back, there is a round staircase that will take you up to the top level of the library and connect folks to the Haldeman Haley House, which sits behind the library. Next slide, Ashley. So this is the rendering of how you will walk into the library. The round staircase that you saw on the previous slide is going to be directly in front of you, and the space connecting the front door to the round staircase is the T. Morris Chester Welcome Center. Next slide, Ashley. This is interesting because you can see the entrance as it exists now. There's a little inset in this slide. Ashley, can you blow that up a little for us, perhaps? If you're familiar with the library, other way, please. There you go. All right, this is fine. You can see now that most folks access the library by going up very beautiful stately steps on either side of the front door. That door will remain. It will be for ceremonial purposes only, and everyone will enter and exit the library through the ground level doors. And this will restore the library entrance back to its original design and intent. Next slide, Ashley. And this is an interior view of folks. You can see the doors towards the rear of this rendering. We'll walk in and down a set of steps or along a ramp that goes to the left, where there will be a display case. And this will be the heart and soul of our museum, and where we will begin housing our T. Morris Chester collections. And do we have one more slide, Ashley, I believe? And then this is very exciting. This is an exterior view. You can see in the inset how the rear of the Haldeman Haley House abuts right next to the library building, and we are going to be co-joining those two buildings with this staircase that will provide access to the library and the Haldeman Haley House itself. So we are very excited to get construction underway. We are in the midst of the silent phase of a $3.5 million capital campaign to raise the money for the restoration and renovation of these two historically significant buildings. We believe that it will be a welcome center for all who come across the Walnut Street Bridge and come to the city of Harrisburg. And we look forward to partnerships with many of the esteemed colleagues that we have heard from this evening and beyond as we begin to envision your place to belong. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. You do us such a great honor by connecting the monument that includes the first full bronze life-size statue of Chester to the Welcome Center, but especially providing the series with a home and the past players with a place to develop their work as they do tours of the riverfront monuments and the African American heritage sites downtown. We're excited to participate in your May 8th public announcement at the Whitaker Center, especially since we would have been eating oysters there at the time of Chester. So it's a very fitting place for us to come. I am way over time, as you know I always am. I would like to ask for three things. The first, if all presenters tonight, if you haven't already done so, if you'll make sure that Ashley and Christina have your articles, your copies, your PowerPoints, so we can begin that memory box for the library. We'll put all of our things in the memory box and hope that it will be used for them to expand their collection. That's number one. Number two is I was serious about that retreat. We need to have the capacity to come together. So maybe I can call upon the library and our friends at the Hilton once the pandemic is lifted and we all have our shots, for us to spend a day or two in deep exchange, because there are so many more stories, resources. The third is, we've mentioned 3 books tonight. We've mentioned the Colored Conventions book. We've mentioned the great book called 100 Voices. Robin Sarah did not get to speak about the book that they're just coming out with, which is a first major telling about the alliance of Thaddeus Stevens and Lydia Hamilton Smith. And Lydia was a member of the Henry Highland Garnett League. That Garnett League hosted and produced the Grand Review of the United States Colored Troops. So all those stories are hub and spoke stories to the library. Please go on the Dauphin County Library Society's website and watch the development of the Thomas Morris Chester Center. And please come back in May. I will try to stay within our 2 hours all the time, but we have great stories to tell and to share. In May, our program is called In His Own Words, and it's actors and living history people doing the speeches of Thomas Chester, with historians doing commentaries around those speeches. So I look forward to seeing you all again. Finally, I apologize for the avalanche of emails that I have sent you in these last 72 hours, but they resulted, I hope, in a very informative, compelling evening. So be well, be safe. Put your questions, comments in the chat, Ashley will be able to save that chat and we'll be able to use it as a record of memory to pick up in May with Chester in his own words. Be blessed. Thank you, Laurie Millage and team, and we'll see you real soon, we hope.